Hi, everybody. Tonight we're talking about Chapter 13 Local Government and Local Government Finances. And we begin with a couple of sort of hot off the press kinds of items related to this topic. So I would say, first, sort of hot off the press concerning the topic would be the pledge that the Gilberts, Dan Gilbert and his wife, some of you may know or realize that Dan Gilbert is a native Detroiter who owns Quicken Loans and the Cleveland Cavaliers. And so he is a major investor in his hometown in Detroit, but also in Cleveland, where he owns and, of course, has the Cavs and several other kinds of operational, if you will, endeavors. So he's been a big investor in Michigan and in the Midwest in general. And so he and his wife have announced recently a major investment in the city of Detroit to the tune of $500 million dollars. That their efforts will indeed be an infusion of cash of $50 million per year for 10 years with respect to helping Detroit's neighborhoods. And so you may also know and understand that Dan Gilbert was instrumental and pivotal in a lot of what people have said is the rebirth of the city of Detroit, particularly going back to 2010 when the process started of Quicken Loans employees moving from suburban Livonia down to the Campus Martius area of downtown Detroit, where they've been for the past 11 years. And in addition to that, the family of companies that Dan Gilbert's empire, in a sense, is a part of or controls ultimately, has influenced directly and indirectly hundreds of property acquisitions and developments in the 11 years since his commitment to Detroit's downtown. So they're starting with this $500 million commitment ultimately by making a big push to get tax arreared properties that are behind, if you will, residential properties in particular that are behind with respect to taxes. If they're in fairly deep tax debt, the idea is to use a significant leverage of this initial amount of money to relieve the tax burdens and relieve the tax debts. And so that's been a big part of Detroit's challenge, in that many of the foreclosed and often blighted and abandoned properties are tied to tax foreclosure, wherein folks have basically seen time run out for them to make payment arrangements on the taxes that they owe for, if you will, the annual tax bill for the property. And so there have been numerous studies done, typically with respect to looking at the city in terms of urban planning and policy, that have declared that that is a significant portion of the blight and abandonment aspects of the city, that much of that is tied to the tax foreclosure process. So what the Gilberts have pledged is incredibly, the potential for this is incredibly positive, and it has a number of attributes that hopefully will make it and deem it a success. And so we'll have to watch that not only roll out for the remainder of the year, but certainly for the next 10 years. So a huge chunk of the local government and finances picture that we're going to be talking about. And it's a way to, again, address what's happening in the city of Detroit writ large. And so, again, Dan Gilbert was asking, and a lot of folks have been asking rather, well, what about the neighborhoods? We've done a lot to stabilize the core, downtown, midtown, new center. What else can we do to undergird, buttress, and stabilize Detroit's neighborhoods? And so this is a good example of some of what we talked about last week with respect to a lot of the public-private partnership kinds of endeavors. This is a good example of that, but this is also a good example of something that's heading in the direction of a people-oriented economic development approach. So, again, we'll have to see what has ultimately uh, happened in the ensuing years as a result of the intentions of this effort. And again, we talked last week about some of the challenges people have had in a comparable yet perhaps short-sighted effort that was done with respect to District Detroit and the Ilitch Company, or the Ilitch organization downtown. And some of that has also been discussed in a number of trade publications, as well as a number of media efforts and endeavors to look at that in terms of the promise, but also the lag with respect to what was promised. And so again, local efforts that have a lot to do ultimately with what happens with local government and how finances are operating and functioning in the city. And again, like we talked also about last week, we talked about the $1.9 trillion stimulus with respect to ultimately getting communities, getting people, getting economies, state, local, and national, hopefully back into a better operating sort of stance. Again, we're looking at significant loss of tax revenue. We're looking at significant joblessness. 10 million jobs have been lost as a direct result of the pandemic and how it's affected local, regional, and of course the country writ large. So we have millions out of work. We have had a number of stimulus efforts to bring about paycheck protections for those who are gig workers, in addition to those who run and own small businesses, in addition to extending and expanding unemployment insurance, as well as direct payments, if you will, to bring about immediate relief. And much of what we've seen also with the stimulus has been ultimately sort of couched and explained as a way to alleviate poverty immediately. And so we're looking at poverty being cut by half, particularly amongst children, as a result of the presence and the impact of the stimulus. And again, also a significant amount of the stimulus is directed towards state and local governments in ways to help them offset the additional costs that they have borne with respect to trying to manage ultimately and make environment safer per the COVID-19 pandemic, but also, of course, because we're looking at a tremendous loss of tax revenue. And so, again, we're looking at this in a sort of 1-2 punch with respect to, again, what the Gilberts have ultimately bequeathed to the city of Detroit, but also what we're seeing across the country in all cities, in all state and local governments with respect to what the pandemic oriented stimulus that we've seen most recently will provide with respect to local governments and state governments. And again, we're talking, of course, ultimately about cities, and we're talking about urban areas and urban municipalities. So lots here that has potential to usher in and bring about significant, real, lasting, impactful change for urban areas. But again, one of the big challenges is that it takes quite a bit of time for a lot of this stuff to sort of get going and get working in ways that the average person may see and benefit from. So the great thing is, with the direct payments from the stimulus, people can go ahead and get those things going immediately once they get those monies. The challenge is a bit greater when we're looking at more structural kinds of things that have to do with how cities and ultimately states and governments function. So again, lots of positives, lots of good things happening, but at the same time, we've got to stay tuned for ultimately what the ultimate, again, impact is going to be. All right, so we need to talk about government and power. When it comes to how a lot of this started, early urban settlements, if we're looking at the villages, say for instance of New York and Boston and Philadelphia, if we're going back to those colonial periods, really volunteers were ultimately those who ran and administered cities. They were not really done by professional operations. They weren't really established in that fashion. Those sorts of operations, different departments and divisions of government, were added much later, particularly with respect to the Industrial Revolution and the industrial period that we saw usher in during the mid-1700s into the mid-1900s. And so much of those time periods, much of that 200-year period, ultimately saw a significant growth of and a significant professionalization in with respect to urban affairs, urban governments, and urban policies. And so this ran the gamut from departments that were ultimately set up for key kinds of services and key kinds of transactions with the public, in addition to degrees and trainings for those specifically who are going to work in public administration, I should say, and in government endeavors as well. And then over time, the politics begin to change as well, and you have something that appears what we sometimes hear called and referred to as machine politics, where you typically have these interwoven, interlocking social groupings that are fairly dynamic but are ultimately conjoined around and in support of a kind of consensus dynamic, often supporting a very leader kind of titular figure. For instance, one of the more recent examples of a sort of machine kind of political organization with respect to Michigan would have to go back to the McNamara years, looking at the czar of Wayne County government and a lot of the professionals that we've seen come out of those kinds of workings. And so often with machine politics, and we've seen this with respect to big cities like Detroit, but also Chicago, New York, and such. With these machines, again, you typically have these groupings of political figures, operatives, and those who support one or a handful of kind of consensus candidates that are ultimately there with respect to consistently providing an image and a vision for what urban government is all about. And so this is a way that loyalty is sort of maintained between those who support the figure and the figure himself or herself. So there's been some discussion as to whether or not we still have machine politics, whether or not they're a part of the growth machine kinds of functionings we see today in cities. I would dare say it doesn't, if you will, politically we don't have a strict machine kind of focus, but nevertheless the growth machine aspects of where there's a pro-growth agenda identified for urban areas and established for such, that indeed is still the case. Also, studies have noted that there are different ways we can look at how going beyond the machine, if you will, urban politics and urban government functions. There's the pluralist sort of route or the pluralist interpretation and the power elite interpretation. And you may, when you think of these, think of them and frame them similarly to how we think of functionalist theory for pluralism, and power elite theory. We may also frame that in a way that is a similar vein to conflict theory or the conflict perspective within sociology as well. So with the pluralist notion, the central idea is that there are competing groups that influence what happens in cities and urban governments. And so the idea is that you don't have these lasting imbalances and shifting alliances. The idea is that you've got all the different groups coming in and mixing and competing, and that this is a sort of natural process. That it's natural that there's going to be one group that sort of comes up and then another one sort of falls away, or it's going to be natural for them to mesh at some point and to come together to create a kind of consensus way of doing things. And so pluralism is going to look at, well, how do these different groups come together to create a coherent kind of functioning government? So you can think about this in a number of different ways. Classically, you can ask the questions of, well, how do all these Michiganders and Michiganians get together, for instance, and put on the auto show, if you will, pre-COVID? And so prior to the pandemic, of course, the auto show had shifted to the plan, I should say, was not just the thought. The plan was to shift the auto show to the summer. We'll have to see if that becomes a reality this current summer, or this coming summer, I should say, if not certainly for next year. So again, lots of different people come together to make the auto show work. It's one of the state's biggest events, if not the biggest event in the state every year. So we have those who are suppliers, we have those who are auto dealers, we have automobile executives, and of course we have the public and we have politicians. We all come together in a sort of pluralist way to pump money and attention if you will, into the coffers and the media presence that happens in and around the auto show on a annual basis. So that's a great example of how pluralism can work. Now, the power elite approach, which again looks at things really more from a conflict perspective, the idea here is that there is an elite group within these cities that ultimately sets the tone and direction for how the city policies are delineated, how they're laid out, how they function, and how they work. And again, if you think about this sort of way of looking at things, you have to sort of ask the question, well, who do we see on a regular basis with respect to those from urban governments who meet regularly with the governor, who meet regularly with the lieutenant governor and other members of the executive cabinet of the governor, if you will, the state government? Who gets together with these folks at the higher levels of government, at the higher levels of power? Which mayors do we see? But also beyond the mayors of which cities and beyond those people who work in certain municipalities and whether or not they are meeting with the governor, we're also looking at which entrepreneurs, which business executives, if you will, which influencers, who has the power ultimately is sort of what this is asking. And so there are certain faces, certain leaders you tend to see over and over again. Of course, durable goods manufacturing, the auto industry, other kinds of durable goods that we manufacture, be it washing machines, any kind of machine technology, of course, is big here in our state. And so those are often among the elite members that may regularly meet with state and local government leaders. And so those are often the kinds of interests that can easily coalesce and become that growth machine, which is another way of sort of looking at things from a power elite kind of standpoint. And so there's always some discussion of, well, does urban government reflect more of the pluralist way of doing things? Does it reflect more of the power elite way of doing things? What I think is really important, particularly for sociologists, is, well, what questions are we asking? And so we have to look at that. What questions are we asking? Where are the resources being distributed? And who benefits? And so even though many of these questions are perhaps more comfortably addressed by the power elite point of view, again, pluralism does certainly ultimately matter because, of course, state and local governments are, by and large, stable endeavors. And so we have to look at them and be willing to look at both of these points of views, if you will, interchangeably. All right, a few other things. We need to talk a little bit more about the local government and financial picture. And so a lot of this goes back to what we had said last week about the urban economy. So finances are typically a few prongs in urban finance or city finance kind of come together. So we're looking at property taxes being one way that cities get income, sales taxes, income taxes, fees, federal aid, and state aid. And so property taxes are typically about 1/4 of a city's revenue with respect to what they bring in annually. And so one of the challenges we have now is with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's not a whole lot of regular property tax revenue additionally, for instance, that we might associate with this kind of economy. In fact, there's probably a good chance that we're going to have significantly less property tax revenue for the foreseeable future. We may have fewer sales. In fact, that's one of the things that we're seeing now, that in some respects it is a seller's market. There's just not a whole lot of inventory out there for sale if we're looking at homes. So that may end up restricting how much tax revenue that we might see additionally accrue to a lot of urban areas, especially if that was budgeted to happen. Again, most urban governments did not budget for something like the pandemic. So again, it's this enormous variable that can directly affect property taxes. Certainly sales taxes are deeply affected. So think about all the times we've been quarantined where we really couldn't go out to our favorite third place. Think about the Raskins third place that we saw, for instance, in the film that we watched last week. So if you think about that, those third places that normally get a lot of interest and a lot of attention from us, those homes away from home, A lot of businesses we've seen they've had to close for a lack of business or for downward pressure on the business. And so with that, you're looking at fewer sales taxes. And of course, with that, you're also perhaps looking at fewer property or less property tax as well. So that becomes a big problem. Even income taxes are impacted because you can file your income tax probably a little bit differently now. A lot of urban governments, particularly if you're looking at the urban core cities of Detroit, Flint, and Saginaw, a lot of them do rely on some kind of employee head tax. However, if employees, particularly during the pandemic, have been working more at home and they've not been commuting to certain kinds of places, their normal place of work, as much, that also affects what kind of tax coffers the cities can ultimately expect to have. And so we're looking at really those pillars, those property taxes, sales taxes, and income taxes. We're looking at those pillars of urban finance being, precarious, being unstable. And so with that precarity, that's a big problem. And so that's where the $1.9 trillion stimulus comes in. It's going to shore up a lot of that instability. At least that's the idea. And it'll do that not only for, if you will, local governments, but also for state government as well. So you can see how vulnerable city finances are. And so think about it. If we hadn't agreed, or at least roughly, ultimately passed that stimulus, what would we do with the hundreds of millions of dollars less that we would see going to Flint, to Detroit, to Saginaw, and so forth? And again, cities have to meet their basic functions in order to survive and in order to provide the residents ultimately the stability that they expect with respect to city services, police, fire, just to name a few. So again, the stimulus is going to be there to address some of where we see the weaker pillars of local government finance happening, if you will, during the pandemic. Right. And so we're looking at a number of these kinds of services that can be directly impacted as a result of financial and revenue instability. And so we're looking at schooling, we're looking at health, we're looking at social services being those core city urban services that are directly affected with respect to less tax revenue. And so what ends up happening often, and we've seen this happen, significant, often cities may have to lay off thousands of employees or hundreds of employees, depending on the size of the city, because there's less revenue coming in. And so we've seen that. So hopefully with the stimulus that we've seen passed, a lot of those employees can be restored, and then city coffers and city departments can indeed be made whole. Cities can borrow under certain conditions, but again, borrowing often becomes incredibly painful. And so we saw that happen in the run-up to and ratcheting up to Detroit's bankruptcy back in 2013. We also saw it happening in Flint's reckoning with respect to emergency management. Both Flint and Detroit had emergency management put in place by the state government during the early parts of the 2010s, and that was met with a number of controversial, if you will, results, if not to some extent, depending on who you talk to, direct failure with respect to the ultimate function of emergency management for urban areas and urban communities. And so borrowing can be done by municipalities, but it may over time become incredibly exorbitant because it needs to ultimately address what was happening at a given time and not to be a continuous process. And so what happens is often borrowing may reveal over time that there is indeed a structural deficit. And so that's one of the challenges that we've seen in a lot of urban areas. And again, think about what we said in terms of local government and finances. If we're looking at corporations, particularly those that may have been manufacturing oriented, if we're looking at a lot of those corporations moving their operations abroad, moving them to the suburbs, if we're looking at the kind of economics we have, the gig economy that we sort of have, a lot of the work that we do is very decentralized. and it doesn't really need an urban context to be done. And so with that, you're already looking at a significant risk to the income tax revenue, the sales tax revenue, even the fees that you can generate to ultimately fund city services. Those become at risk. You can borrow, of course, to replace some of that which you lost, but at the same time, once that becomes a successive process, and we saw this in the case of Flint and Detroit, you're looking at structural deficits. And a lot of what we're seeing happening in the city of Chicago now is also a matter of that, where again, you're looking at, well, we need to spend more than we're taking in because we have these essential services we've got to provide. So what's the answer? Sure, in the short term, you can find all kinds of people that will allow a municipality to borrow, but these may become very exorbitant kinds of ways of trying to finance city business ultimately. And so structural deficits have to be addressed at some point, and in some cases they can be addressed by very, very painful cuts in addition to layoffs, but maybe ultimately cutting pensions and benefits of retirees and even current workers. That becomes a way that cities can sometimes rein in those costs, ultimately renegotiating debts, and certainly the ultimate way is through bankruptcy, where you have a bankruptcy trustee judge that says, okay, this is how we're going to handle these debts. Maybe we do 50 cents on a dollar or even less to just excise, get rid of this debt so that the city can move forward. So we saw a number of those kinds of actions taken during the early and mid 2010s with respect to the city of Detroit and its bankruptcy process, and a lot of that also initiated by the emergency manager, Mr. Kevin Orr. And so a lot of that went on over the past, or I should say, about 8-ish years ago or so. So a lot of this is referred to as a sort of fiscal distress kind of circumstance, where your expenses exceed what you're bringing in, when the expenses exceed the revenues. And so New York was a good example of this during the late 70s. New York City, there's some discussion about New York today in terms of, well, what's going to happen with so much ultimately receding in New York City and the boroughs of New York City with respect to the pandemic. How will the city of New York be affected? And so there have been, particularly within I should say, the New York Times and other publications, there have been some discussions of, well, how bad are things going to be? And again, we won't really know some of this for a while. We'll have to see what happens with respect to the stimulus and how it impacts cities like New York and the coffers that they would normally expect to have. So fiscal distress, again, a lot of these matters are structural deficits because, again, you're looking at tax revenue in a lot of respects moving away from the city as residential development moves to the burbs, as people tend to depopulate cities to some extent over time. It's not, of course, a complete wholesale depopulation, but we're looking at, again, a shifting of much of the metropolitan reality that we have, shifting from the core city to the suburban ring of that core city. And so with that happening, people take their sales tax revenue with them. They take their, property tax revenues with them. And businesses have done the same sorts of things. And so the edge cities are a good example of how this process happens. So, of course, the city does still have major corporations. Cities still have that. They still have the entertainment districts. They still have that. But they are competed with much of what's happening out in the suburban ring or in other cities around the country. And so you end up with this structural deficit where you've got the same need to provide the same services you always have. Police, fire, education, social services, those things have to be done. But at the same time, at what cost? How do they get done? Who's going to pay for them? And again, we don't, unlike European counterpart cities, we don't have a whole lot of regional planning or central planning norms to promote and protect urban core cities from the vagaries, if you will, of these kinds of structural deficits. And so that's the challenge that ultimately a lot of the older industrial kinds of cities have had, be it those in the Northeast, be it those in the Midwest. But now with the pandemic, we're looking at, in some respects, an equalization of this, where Sunbelt cities, even though they don't have the legacy costs nearly as much as what we've seen in the cities of the Northeast and Midwest, they are still incredibly vulnerable with respect to the loss of sales tax revenue, the loss of income tax revenue, and the loss of property tax revenue as a direct response to the coronavirus pandemic. All right. And there have been some strategies that have been utilized, suggested. A lot of what has been suggested to handle these structural deficits is some sort of regional planning norm, some sort of way of equalizing tax bases. So what you're seeing is a regional way of smoothing out, if you will, the expenses and the revenues that are brought in. To an extent, how we fund schools here in the state of Michigan is a good example of that, wherein we adopt and administer, I should say, a grant of the same equal, if you will, the same amount per child to every district. So that's been in place for a couple of decades now, but nevertheless, even there, we still see significant local inequalities emerge, especially because some districts can still, on top of that money that we ultimately all get from Lansing, they can find other ways to, at the local level, ratchet up more of what that base grant is per student. So equalizing tax bases and finding ways to say, you know what, it's one big region. We all have to find ways to share. We all have to find ways to take into account the core city's legacy costs. So those approaches have been adopted in some cases, probably most notably in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. Although, again, they don't have the legacy costs typically that you see in a city like Detroit or Philadelphia or New York. So even there may be limitations. We're often looking at very apples to oranges kinds of comparisons.